Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, another in my series of what I call heavy thoughts. This is where I take a moment to ramble on about something that's been on my mind. And the topic that I wanted to talk about today was grunge. Did grunge kill heavy metal? What do I think of grunge? Is it metal? So I've mentioned this before in other videos that I think I'm of a really interesting age. When I was in high school, there were, in the 80s, there were just as many kids listening to the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin and the Doors. So I was getting a bunch of that. Plus I was listening to Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Dio, all that kind of stuff that was coming out in the 80s, including like Rat, Dawkins, that kind of stuff. But I was still young enough that when the 90s rolled around and grunge hit, so grunge is, if I'm sure most people know, it's a style of heavy music that came out of Seattle in the late 80s and came to prominence and popularity in the early 90s. So I was young enough that when grunge hit, I was still able to get into it. I wasn't, totally out of touch with what was going on or had abandoned popular music at that point. And it was still the early 90s, so it was before the internet, before, MTV was still playing videos and stuff like that. So for me, it's funny, when grunge first happened, my first exposure to it was like Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam. And when I heard those bands, and Soundgarden was the first band that I heard from that whole scene. When I heard those bands, now you got to remember this is now the early 90s, and metal that you were hearing, quote metal, I put it in quotes because the stuff that was getting played to death on MTV and on the radio at this point was stuff like Slaughter and Firehouse and Trickster and the Nelson Twins, or whatever they were called. And, this was like pop metal, and it was just so oversaturated. It was so everywhere. I was so sick of it. It was so phony and plastic and just formulaic. Every band at this point was putting out the power ballad, and bands were going acoustic, and it was so cliche. It was so tiresome. I had sort of moved away a little bit from metal in the late 80s, early 90s. My favorite bands like Maiden and Priest were putting out my least favorite albums from them. So although I was still paying attention and buying their records, it had lost something for me in the like 89, 90, 91. So when I heard Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam, like Soundgarden for me, I heard that and I was like, whoa, this is great return to 70s heavy, Sabbathy style riffing and metal. To me, it was a very 70s heavy band. And the same thing when I heard Alice in Chains. They sounded a little bit more modern-ish metal, like early, maybe 80s-ish metal. But it was still, to me, it was like, oh man, this is a great return to just great metal. Pearl Jam, for me, sounded like a great hard 70s hard rock band. And I remember reading, as I was thinking of this video, I can picture myself reading this like music magazine at a record store at our mall. And this is like probably 90, 91, and Soundgarden had just come out, or they had like their EP out and stuff. And I remember reading an interview with them, and they were talking about Black Sabbath and like heavy 70s bands. And I was like, whoa, this is so cool. These bands want to return to this kind of sound, which is what I was totally into. As you know from my channel, I'm into 70s, heavy 70s stuff, and I'm into like the 80s metal type stuff. So it was weird when the grunge tag started getting applied to this stuff, and it started turning into this anti-metal thing. Like grunge came and it destroyed metal. Grunge was anti-metal. It was kind of sold and portrayed this way. And in some ways it was. It was anti to Trickster and Firehouse and Poison and all that ridiculous radio pop drivel that was going on at that time. But it was confusing because to me it was like, wait a minute, there's a serious metal and hard rock element to this early to that stuff, to Soundgarden and Alice in Chains. And so it was sort of confusing when that this tag grunge got put on it, and it became sort of this, metal then got sort of, pushed underground or shoved away, or at least the melodic bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, all those bands suffered in the 90s. And I know that there was, death, this 90s, in the 90s is when death metal, late 80s, 90s, death metal came around, and black metal came around. So there was still plenty of metal going on in the underground. But for me, I really didn't get into death metal and black metal till later on. But what we would call sort of the mainstream metal, and I'm going to just, for the sake of it, lump in Rat, Dokken, Iron Maiden, Dio, Ozzy, all those people that were on MTV and all that stuff that were getting played on the radio. That stuff just got obliterated. And it was more when Nirvana showed up. And Nirvana showed up in 92, I believe, with Nevermind, and Nirvana sort of took it. Now, Nirvana came from more of a punk side of it, and although I when it came out, I kind of liked it. I don't think I ever bought Nevermind, to tell you the truth, because to me, I'm not a punk fan, and what I heard in Nirvana was the punk influence, and the songs were catchy and everything, but I don't know, it didn't do it for me. I was more Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam. That's what I was into from the 70s, or from the Seattle sound. Those were the bands that I was into. Melvins, I also liked the Melvins. But I just didn't like the punk side of it. I didn't like Nirvana and like that kind of thing that was going on in Sonic Youth and bands like that. I just wasn't into that. And so it was, here in the US at least, and maybe people can leave comments down below, what was it like where you were starting when Nevermind came out, 92 through the 90s? For here in the States, it was like all those bands it was like somebody dropped a nuclear bomb and just obliterated those bands off the map. Bands like Rat and Dokken and Twisted Sister, they were just like an asteroid landed and took out the dinosaurs. That's what happened to them. And even the biggies like Maiden and Priest, they all struggled through the 90s. They did better over in Europe, but here in the States, I mean, Iron Maiden was basically not even able to tour. They were coming over here and they were playing small theaters, and things were getting canceled. The same thing for Sabbath, and Dio was playing clubs, mid-sized clubs at that time. And so it was a really rough time for that kind of classic, traditional sounding metal. It was still going on and bands were still doing it, but they were not getting any attention on MTV or on the radio and stuff. Grunge just basically came and took it all over. And unfortunately, I think what happened is that Nirvana came out, and I'm getting ready to do a video on Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger, which was released on the same day as Nirvana's Nevermind. And I think Nevermind took the spotlight away. Everything began they were the biggest of all those bands. And so all the copycat bands started copying the Nirvana sound, which was that punkish type of thing. Whereas I think if Nevermind hadn't come out, maybe, because Soundgarden did go on to be, become even more popular with Super Unknown, and they became huge. So did Alice in Chains. But I don't think as many bands went in the direction of Alice in Chains and Soundgarden, which was, to me, the more metal side of grunge. To me, it was just metal. But if you want to call it grunge, it's the more metal side of grunge. Whereas Nirvana was more on the punk side, and I think more bands went on the Nirvana side. And to me, it would have been more interesting if people had followed more in the Alice in Chains, Soundgarden style. Because again, to me, it was metal to me. It was heavy riffing. Alice in Chains had a lot of great guitar soloing in it from Jerry Cantrell. They're another band that I'm gonna do some videos on. That early first wave of grunge, I really liked it. I loved it, actually. It's sort of right around 90, 91. I started getting back into metal, started looking into, hey, what's his Bruce Dickinson solo albums, the stuff that Dio was doing. And I was also really into Soundgarden and Alice in Chains and, that kind of heavier side of grunge. And for me, it would be, now here's where my age plays into this. Really, that was the last time that I followed any kind of new heavy music. In fact, when I was getting ready for this video, I thought to myself, like, really, what came after that? Heavy music that came after that, after the grunge thing that was mainstream, that blew up and got really popular. And I don't know. I mean, I guess like new metal stuff like Disturbed and Five Finger Death Punch. I guess again here I don't follow that stuff. I don't like that stuff. I was off the boat, man. I was done after Soundgarden and Pearl Jam. Those were the last new bands that I was really into and buying their stuff when it was coming out. I bought those Pearl Jam albums the day they came out. Same thing with Soundgarden, the same thing with Alice in Chains. And that movement then was really popular. It was all over the magazines and MTV and the radio at that time. And really since then, and I don't know if it's because of the dawn of the internet and everything, maybe we'll never have another one kind of style and movement that just sort of consumes everybody for a couple years. Maybe that's just not possible anymore. But for me, it was the last new style of music, if you will, that I really followed and that I got into. Unfortunately, there's really only a handful of bands that I listen to from that whole thing still today, and that would be Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam. There's some other bands. Again, I like the Melvins, and I'm trying to think of there's other bands that have a couple songs that I like here and there, but really there weren't a ton of bands from that whole early 90s grunge thing that I followed and got into and followed for years. I followed them for those couple of years when they came out, and then really that was it. So there you go. There's did it kill heavy metal? I mean, no, of course not. Death metal and black metal went on, and the traditional metal bands, there were still bands doing traditional metal in the 90s. Iced Earth, and in the 90s was the rise of power metal. So it was maybe more in Europe than it was here in the States. So of course it didn't kill metal. It killed all the bands like Trickster and Firehouse, and that was all for the better in my opinion. And it brought everything back down to earth. And I get it. I was watching a video of Pearl Jam playing for a outdoors radio station concert in Seattle, and it was 5 days before their first album 10 came out. And man, they are on fire. They play the whole album basically, and they are just on fire. And Eddie Vedder is a great stage presence. Later on, he seemed to calm that down a little bit, but back then, it was just tons of energy and excitement. Same thing with Soundgarden. I went back and watched some early videos of them, and I get why that stuff sort of blew up, because man, it was just unique. It was different. It was more down to earth with the, they did away with the whole ridiculous glam stuff. Temple of the Dog, that's another band that I do enjoy. They got more down to earth. The lyrics and the subject matter were darker and heavier and more realistic and everything. They did away with all the goofy party love stuff. So for me, it was something that I liked. Maybe the last newish style of music that I got into. So there you go. That's my thoughts, my heavy thoughts here on grunge, and you're going to be seeing me do some videos on some grunge bands. So the bands that I like Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. So let me know, what do you think of grunge? I know that a lot of people that watch my channel are in my age bracket. So where were you when the whole thing hit? I'd be really interested to hear people from outside the U.S. How did grunge, what was the impact that grunge had on metal where you were over in Europe, or if you're from Scandinavia or wherever? Uh, how did it affect, and what was the impact of grunge over there, and what are your thoughts on it? Are there any bands that you like from that? Do you still listen to any of those bands today? I revisited a lot of this stuff recently for the first time in a really long time, and man, I really dug it. And that's what made me think, like, man, I got to do a couple videos on this stuff, because there's some great heavy stuff on here. Great musicianship, great singing, great songwriting, great production. So, okay, let me know what you think about grunge in the comments down below, and make sure you hit like and subscribe. And until we see you again, make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.